The evening sky over the New Mexico territory bled from gold into ash. The last light stretched thin across a land of mesquite, dust, and silence. Elias Harrow rode the fence line of his ranch with the weariness of a man who had forgotten how to expect anything new from the world. His hat brim cast his face in shadow, his shoulders stooped from years of weather and solitude. The cattle grazed in the distance, shapes against a fading horizon, while the cicadas struck up their restless hymn. It was then that he saw her. At first, Elias thought she was no more than a bundle of rags, abandoned near the far edge of the pasture where the land dipped into an arroyo. But as his horse drew nearer, he saw the slight rise and fall of her shoulders, the faint curve of a figure kneeling in the dirt. The girl's wrists were bound with rust-bitten iron, her ankles bruised from rope. Her dark hair hung in two unkempt braids that brushed the ground, dust clinging to the strands. She did not look up as his shadow fell over her. Elias dismounted slowly, boots pressing into dry earth. "Who left you here?" His voice was low, worn by years of talking to no one but cattle and wind. The girl made no answer. Her head remained bowed, her face hidden. Only her breathing, shallow, uneven, proved she still clung to life. Elias noticed the angry red marks circling her wrists, skin rubbed raw beneath the chains. He set his jaw. He had seen the work of drifters before, men who thought nothing of binding another soul for sport or profit. They must have passed through, leaving her behind like cast-off tack once she was of no use to them. Elias's first thought was that he should walk away. He had enough ghosts in his cabin already. His wife buried 3 winters past, his land slowly swallowing itself in drought. Trouble was a thing he had learned to keep at arm's length, yet something in the bowed figure held him still. "Can you stand?" he asked. Her silence weighed more than words. She neither moved nor lifted her eyes. Elias let out a breath, rubbed a hand across the stubble on his jaw, and finally stooped. He broke the chain with a strike of his hatchet, the iron clanging against stone. The girl flinched at the sound but did not flee. Elias lifted her by the arm. She was light, frighteningly so, as though the world had taken more from her than it had ever given. When she staggered, he steadied her, and without thinking, half-carried her toward his horse. She did not resist, though her head remained bowed, her eyes fixed on the ground. By the time they reached the cabin, night had settled. Stars scattered themselves like cold sparks across the black, and the chill of desert air crept in. Elias lit the lantern inside, filling the single-room cabin with dim, flickering light. Its wooden walls bore the marks of years, nail heads rusted, rafters bowed, the rocking chair by the fire worn smooth where his wife's hands had rested. He sat the girl on a stool near the hearth and set about kindling a flame. The fire caught slowly, spitting sparks until warmth began to spread. Elias placed a pot of beans over the coals, their scent mingling with smoke. He poured water into a tin cup and handed it to her. "Drink," he said. She obeyed, hands trembling, the tin clicking against her teeth. Still, her gaze stayed low. She ate the beans as though she had forgotten what food was, her shoulders hunched, her shawl drawn tight. Elias studied her in silence. She was young, no older than 20, perhaps younger, but her silence carried the weight of years. The braids, though tangled, had once been carefully woven. The shawl she clutched was worn thin, patched in places, yet he could tell it had been made with care. These small remnants of dignity clung to her even now, though the world had stripped her bare. He turned his eyes to the fire, the weight in his chest growing heavier. For a moment he saw his wife sitting there instead, her posture not unlike the girl's, head bent over needle and thread. The memory burned sharp, as though grief had been waiting for just this crack in his guard to slip back in. He pressed his hands against his knees until the ache in his knuckles steadied him. When the girl finished eating, Elias spoke again. "You'll stay here tonight. In the morning we'll see." She did not answer, only lowered her head further. The silence in the cabin grew thick. Outside, coyotes called across the mesas, their cries rising like mournful hymns. Elias sat in the rocking chair, its creak the only rhythm against the hush. He could feel her presence like a stone in water. Still, heavy, altering the shape of everything around it. He did not know what to make of her silence. It was not the silence of defiance, nor even of fear. It was deeper, as though words themselves had been chained and beaten out of her. He had known silence well since the day the shovel struck earth above his wife's coffin. But this was different. Hers was not chosen, it was endured. The firelight painted her face in shadows, and for a fleeting moment she lifted her eyes just enough that he saw the glimmer of something raw, shame, sorrow, perhaps both. Then her gaze dropped again. Elias looked away, unsettled. He had not expected her presence to reach inside him like this, stirring grief he had kept buried. He told himself he did not want her here, that she was trouble, that she would draw the eyes of men who carried rifles and rode without mercy. Yet even as he thought it, he knew he could not cast her out. He stood, banking the fire low, and set a blanket on the floor beside the hearth. "You'll sleep here," he said. Still no words from her. Only the faintest nod, her braids slipping over her shoulders like dark cords. Elias lay on his own bed against the far wall, though sleep did not come easily. The sound of her breathing, uneven, cautious, filled the cabin. He stared at the rafters until the fire burned down to embers. Outside, the land lay hushed under the stars, the wide silence of desert night pressing against the wooden walls. Inside, another silence reigned, two souls bound in grief and endurance, each unwilling or unable to break it, and as he closed his eyes, Elias realized that the girl's bowed head mirrored his own life, both shackled, both unwilling to meet the world straight on, for reasons he could not yet name. That truth unsettled him more than the loneliness ever had. The days passed without ceremony, folding one into the other like pages left unmarked. Elias Harrow rose each morning before dawn, as he always had, to the sound of the wind brushing the shutters and the distant cry of coyotes giving way to silence. He would stoke the fire, pour a measure of water into the blackened coffee pot, and let its bitter scent fill the cabin. The routine was as old as his grief, yet now it was no longer his alone. The girl, though Elias did not know her name at first, kept her place near the hearth. When he left to mend fences or drive cattle, she lingered behind, moving through the cabin like a shadow that left no trace of sound. She tended the small chores without being asked, sweeping dust from the corners with a bundle of willow twigs, folding blankets, fetching water from the barrel outside. Always her face was bent toward the ground, her dark braids falling forward to shield her eyes. For Elias, the silence was both familiar and strange. His wife Clara had filled this same cabin with soft hums and the rustle of skirts. He remembered her rocking in the chair near the fire, humming a tune while folding laundry with hands both capable and gentle. Now, the chair still creaked, but only beneath his own weight. The only sounds were the scrape of a shovel in the yard, the clatter of tin against wood, and the occasional cough from the girl when the smoke from the fire grew heavy. One evening, Elias returned from the north pasture, boots coated in dust, and found her seated at the table with the tattered shawl she had carried since the night he found her. In the lantern light, she was mending it with careful stitches, her fingers deft despite the scars circling her wrists. The shawl itself was nothing but faded fabric, frayed at the edges, but she held it with a reverence he could not quite understand. She did not look up when he entered, and he did not ask. Yet the sight of her bent over the fabric stirred something in him. The following day, he found his rifle where it hung above the hearth. Dust had gathered thick along its barrel, for he had not fired it in years. Still, he took it down, sat at the table across from her, and began to oil the steel. The smell of gun oil mingled with the faint smoke of the fire, sharp and metallic against the air. The girl did not speak, but she glanced once at the weapon, then back to her shawl. Elias felt her unease as clearly as if she had spoken aloud. His hands slowed against the cloth. He could not forget what rifles had meant to her people, what they had meant to his as well. The land itself still bore the scars, burned-out camps, broken arrows left in the dust, crosses planted hastily where the ground drank too much blood. He remembered the stories told around saloon tables, of raids and reprisals, each side swearing vengeance for what the other had done. He had lost neighbors in such conflicts, men he had mended fence posts beside. Yet, as he looked at the girl, this silent figure whose shoulders curled inward as though to protect what was left of her, he wondered which side of those stories held truth. Perhaps none, perhaps both. That night, Elias sat in the rocking chair, staring into the flames. The fire cracked and hissed, casting shadows against the walls. He thought of Clara, her laughter echoing faintly in memory, and felt the hollow echo of her absence. He thought of the girl's bowed head, her silence pressed against the cabin like another presence. For all his wishing, he could not untangle them. The dead woman who had left him empty, and the living one who now filled the silence with something heavier than grief. It was on the fourth night, when a storm rolled in from the mountains, that the weight of it all shifted. The wind rose first, moaning against the shutters. Then the rain came, sheets of it slashing against the roof, drumming in steady rhythm. Thunder cracked overhead, rattling the cabin walls. Elias set a bucket beneath a leak in the corner, watching as droplets splashed into the tin with dull insistence. Through the storm's noise, he heard it, faint at first, then clearer. The girl was weeping. She sat by the hearth, her shawl clutched tight around her, her face hidden. The sound that escaped her was not loud, not the wailing of grief, but something far more fragile. It was the sound of glass breaking in the dark, a thing that should not be heard, and yet could not be ignored. Elias froze in the center of the room, unsure whether to step forward or remain where he was. He felt like an intruder in his own cabin, caught between duty and trespass. His instinct was to offer comfort, but something in her posture, her hunched shoulders, her bowed head, warned him that this sorrow was not his to enter, so he did not move. Instead, he stood by the window staring at the storm outside. Lightning split the horizon, illuminating the wide emptiness of the land, and in its flash, Elias felt the truth settle into him. Silence was not emptiness. It was a language, one he had spoken himself for years without knowing it. Her silence told of chains and shame, of nights stolen and dignity torn. His told of a grave on a hillside, of love lost and years survived without reason, different silences yet kin to each other. The storm raged on. The girl's weeping ebbed to quiet tremors, then finally to stillness. Elias turned back toward her, but she had pulled the shawl over her head and lay curled beside the fire, her breath shallow but steady. He banked the coals low, then returned to his chair. The storm's roar dulled with distance, leaving only the steady creak of the rocker and the memory of that fragile sound. Elias did not speak, nor did he reach for her. Yet something had shifted in him all the same. Compassion had crept in, unbidden and unwelcome, yet impossible to deny. It was not pity. He despised the thought of it. It was something quieter, heavier, the knowledge that he was not as alone in his silence as he had believed. And though no words passed between them, Elias understood. Two prisoners had found themselves under the same roof. One bound by chains of iron, the other by chains of memory. The storm outside eased toward dawn, but within the cabin the silence endured, no longer empty but shared. The storm came first as a murmur along the horizon, a gray smudge of cloud rolling over the mountains, then swelling into a wall of shadow that blotted out the stars. By the time the first drop struck the dust, Elias had already shuttered the windows, his hands working with the practiced rhythm of a man long used to the land's tempers. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low, its light fighting against the gloom. Nayeli crouched near the hearth, shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders, her braids damp from gathering kindling before the rain broke. She did not speak, but her eyes flickered toward the door with unease, as though storms themselves carried memories of chains. The rain thickened into sheets, hammering the roof. Water slipped through a gap in the boards and began dripping steadily into a tin bucket Elias had set beneath. Each drop rang against the metal with a sharp, hollow note. It was in this unsettled hour that hoofbeats sounded through the storm. Elias froze, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle that rested on its rack. Few men rode in weather such as this without reason. A sharp knock rattled the door. "Open up!" a voice called, muffled by the rain yet edged with command. Nayeli stiffened. Without words, she slid deeper into the shadows beside the hearth, her shawl hiding her face. Elias crossed the floor and unbarred the door with deliberate slowness. The man who stood on the threshold was broad-shouldered, his slicker dripping with rain. His eyes, small and sharp, narrowed against the firelight. Behind him, his horse shifted restlessly, its breath steaming in the cold. "Evening," Elias said flatly, though no part of the night felt like one worth greeting. The man tipped his hat, but did not smile. "Storm caught me on the trail. Figured I'd see if anyone out here had seen what I'm looking for." "And what's that?" Elias asked. The stranger's gaze drifted past him into the room. "There've been some runaways, Apache, dangerous folk. One girl in particular. Word is she slipped her chains. Men are riding to find her. If you're keeping what don't belong." He let the words hang, like a rope swaying from a gallows beam. Elias felt the weight of the rifle at his side, though he did not lift it. "Haven't seen anyone." His voice carried no tremor, only the blunt edge of a man unwilling to be drawn into another's hunt. The stranger studied him, suspicion flickering across his weather-beaten face. Lightning split the sky, and for a moment the man's features were cast in harsh relief, thin lips, eyes hard as flint, a jaw set in cruelty. Then the darkness swallowed him again. "You'd best remember," the man said, leaning closer. "Harboring one of them will bring you more trouble than you can carry. Best not to invite ruin." Elias's hand tightened on the edge of the door. "This is my land," he said, his tone flat as stone. "And I invite no man to tell me what I may keep beneath my roof." For a heartbeat, neither moved. Rain hammered, thunder rolled. Then the stranger spat into the mud, tugged the brim of his hat, and swung into the saddle. Without another word, he rode off into the storm, his horse's hooves swallowed by rain and thunder. Elias shut the door hard, sliding the bar back into place. For a moment he stood there, listening to the storm as though it might yet carry the man's voice back through the cracks. But there was only rain, only thunder. Behind him, Nayeli sat motionless, her shawl clutched in white-knuckled fists. Her chest rose and fell too quickly, though she tried to quiet her breath. The firelight caught the damp sheen of her eyes. "You're safe," Elias said, though he could not be certain. "For now." He crossed to the hearth and added wood to the flames. The logs hissed, sparks spitting upward, until the light steadied once more. Nayeli trembled, her gaze darting toward the door, then the window, then back to the fire, as though she feared shadows might break through the walls. Awkwardly, Elias removed his coat, still heavy with rain, and shook the water from it. Then, without a word, he draped it around her shoulders. The gesture felt clumsy, ill-fitted to a man who had long forgotten the small kindnesses of comfort. Yet when the weight of the coat settled over her, something in her posture eased. Slowly, hesitantly, Nayeli lifted her face. For the first time since he had found her, her eyes met his. They were dark, deep as river stone, reflecting the firelight in tiny sparks. No chain held them now. There was fear there still, but beneath it something else. Defiance, and perhaps the faintest ember of trust. Elias held her gaze without words. He felt the storm's roar outside, the rain drumming, thunder splitting the sky. But all of it seemed to fade against the quiet weight of her eyes. In that unspoken moment, something shifted. Not with sudden heat, but with the slow certainty of earth cracking after long drought. When she finally lowered her gaze again, it was not to hide. It was to rest. Elias returned to the rocking chair, its creak joining the storm's chorus. He knew the danger had not passed. Men like the rider would return, perhaps with others, perhaps with violence. By sheltering her, he had chosen a side, though he had not spoken it aloud. The storm raged long into the night, thunder rolling like distant gunfire, rain pounding as though to wash the world clean. Within the cabin, the firelight glowed steady, casting warmth against the walls. Nayeli, wrapped in his coat, sat near the hearth, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, but no longer lowered in shame. Elias watched her, then turned his gaze to the flames. He had not asked for this storm, not the one outside nor the one within. Yet he knew with a clarity as sharp as the lightning splitting the sky that he would weather both. The storm passed, leaving the land washed clean, the air sharp with the scent of wet mesquite and damp earth. For a day the sky stretched wide and blue, as though the heavens themselves sought to forget the thunder that had torn them open. Life on the ranch returned to its rhythm, though it was no longer the rhythm of one man alone. Elias rose before dawn, as always. Yet when he stepped outside, he would find that the water trough had already been filled, the kindling stacked neatly near the door, or the cabin swept clean of dust that had gathered overnight. Nayeli moved like breath itself, quiet, steady, unseen, until her work was finished. He said little to her, but he noticed. One morning, as the sun bled red along the horizon, Elias found her in the corral, standing near the horses. She reached out, palm hovering just shy of a mare's flank, whispering words in her tongue so soft they might have been mistaken for wind. The mare, skittish with strangers, stood still beneath her hand, ears flicking but body calm. When she sensed Elias nearby, Nayeli drew her hand back, her gaze dropping, but not before he had seen the gentleness there. It was on that same day he set an axe into her hands. "Wood needs splitting," he said simply, pointing toward the pile of logs near the shed. He expected her to refuse or to falter, but she only nodded. She lifted the axe, her grip unpracticed but determined, and brought it down with a sharp crack. The first swing was clumsy. By the fifth, the blade found its rhythm. Elias stood back, silent, and let her continue. There was strength in her yet, he realized. Not the kind born of choice, but of necessity. Later, by the fire, he taught her to grind coffee beans with the old mortar his wife had once used. The sound of stone against stone filled the room, joined by the faint scent of bitter grounds. He showed her how to measure the handfuls, how to pour the boiling water slow, how to wait. She listened, her hands steady, her expression unreadable. When the pot was ready, he poured a cup and handed it to her. She sipped cautiously, her lips tightening at the taste, but she did not refuse it. Through these small lessons, an uneasy companionship grew. Not a friendship, not yet, but the fragile bond of two souls circling one another, testing the edges of silence. And still, she kept her rituals. At dawn, Elias would see her braiding her hair, each strand woven with careful precision, as though order itself were a shield. Sometimes, when she thought him too far away to hear, she whispered in her language, soft syllables that carried no meaning to him, but lingered in the air like prayers. Once, as he passed the doorway, he caught a word repeated, her voice no louder than the creak of the timbers. He did not intrude, but outside the ranch, the world was not so quiet. Neighbors passed more often than they used to, their horses kicking up dust along the road. Men's eyes lingered too long when Elias nodded in greeting, suspicion hidden beneath courtesy. In the town, whispers stirred. A rancher keeping to himself was one thing. A rancher hiding someone else's troubles was another. Elias felt the weight of those stares, the prickle of rumor pressing closer each day. At night, when the lamp burned low, Elias sat in his rocking chair and stared into the fire. Nayeli would sit nearby, shawl wrapped tight, mending or simply folding and refolding cloth as though her hands needed something to occupy them. The silence between them stretched, sometimes comforting, sometimes unbearable. It was on such a night that Elias spoke of the thing he had held closest. "My wife's buried up on the hill behind the mesquite grove," he said, voice quiet, almost as though speaking to the flames themselves. 3 winters now. Fever took her. The words fell into the air like stones into a well, rippling, but unanswered. Nayeli did not move, but her hands stilled against the fabric she had been folding. "I built this place for her," Elias continued. "Every board, every stone in the hearth. Thought it'd be a house full of voices someday." His gaze flicked toward the empty rafters. "Never thought I'd end up talking to ghosts." The silence that followed was long, but not hollow. Nayeli did not speak. He had not expected her to, but her presence at the hearth was steady. Her shawl lay drawn close around her shoulders, yet her eyes, when she lifted them, met his briefly. There was no pity in them, only acknowledgement, a quiet recognition that grief was a language both of them understood. Elias did not ask about her scars, though he saw them often, white lines across her wrists, faint marks at her collarbone when the shawl slipped. Questions burned in him, but he held them back. He knew some wounds could not bear the weight of another man's voice. The firelight cracked, sparks scattering like brief stars before vanishing. The room smelled of smoke and boiled coffee, of damp wood drying after rain. Elias felt the pull of something fragile in the air, as though one wrong word might shatter it. Their bond was not built of speech, but of survival, of two lives pressed close by chance and need. Fragile as firelight on wet wood, but real. Elias leaned back in the rocker, letting its creak fill the silence. He realized then that loneliness had blinded him, made him believe silence was emptiness. But now silence carried weight, hers and his together. It frightened him more than solitude ever had because it meant he was no longer untouched. Across the fire, Nayeli shifted slightly, drawing her shawl tighter, but she did not bow her head as low as before. For the first time, Elias wondered if safety, fragile though it was, might be possible under this roof. The sun had scarcely lifted above the hills when the sound of hooves broke the quiet. Elias knew before he looked that they were not friendly riders. Dust trailed behind them, 4 men on horses, ranch hands from neighboring spreads. Their laughter was hard, brittle, meant to carry warning. Elias stepped out from the barn, rifle slung loose across his shoulder. The men drew up at the gate, their horses stamping, eyes bright. The leader, a thick-set man with a hat pulled low, spat into the dust. "Word is you're keeping an Apache girl here," he said, voice rough with scorn. "That so?" Elias's jaw worked, but he did not answer. Another man leaned in his saddle, grinning sharp. "You know what they bring, trouble. Her kind don't belong in white men's homes. You want her gone before that trouble finds you." Elias lifted his rifle then, slow and deliberate, the barrel glinting in the morning light. His voice was quiet, but it carried. "She stays." The laughter died. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, only the creak of leather and the restless shifting of hooves filling the air. The men exchanged looks, measuring him, measuring the steadiness in his stance. "You'll regret it," the leader muttered at last, pulling his reins. The horses wheeled, dust rising like smoke as they rode off, their threats trailing in the wind. Elias stood long after they were gone, rifle still steady in his hands, until the silence returned to the land. His heart beat hard, but his resolve was set. He had chosen. That night, firelight flickered across the cabin walls, throwing long shadows that seemed to move with every breath. The air was heavy, as though the men's words still lingered, as though the land itself held its breath. Nayeli sat close to the hearth, her shawl drawn around her shoulders, her face turned toward the flames. For days she had spoken little, her silence thick as stone. But now her voice came, a whisper at first, then words shaped with trembling defiance. "They came at dawn," she said, her accent carrying both music and weight. "Soldiers, guns, we ran. My brother was still a boy. He tried to fight. They shot him." Elias did not move, did not speak. His hands tightened on the arms of his chair. "They chained me," she went on, her eyes fixed on the fire. "Made me walk, days, nights. I do not know how long." They laughed. "Said I was nothing. Sold me for whiskey, for coins." Her voice cracked, but did not break. "I kept silent because silence cannot be beaten. Silence is a wall, but silence is also a grave." The words fell into the room like sparks, each one burning, each one refusing to be buried. Elias felt them sear into him, hotter than the fire at his feet. Nayeli's hands trembled as she clutched her shawl, but her chin lifted. For the first time since he had found her in chains, she met his eyes fully. In that gaze there was no plea for pity, no begging for rescue, only the fierce, fragile claim of one who had been stripped of all and yet still stood. "I am not theirs," she said, her voice steady now. "Not anymore." Elias's throat tightened. He could not summon words, and perhaps none were needed. He only nodded, slow and grave, and in that nod was witness. Not savior, not master, witness. The fire between them glowed hotter. Not of danger, but of something more fragile. Dignity returned. For long minutes they sat in silence. But it was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the silence of those who had spoken what could not be unsaid. Elias leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his gaze on the flames. He thought of the men who had come that morning, their threats hanging in the dust. He thought of the rifle that lay across his lap. For years he had sought only quiet, to live unnoticed, untouched. But now he knew quiet was no refuge. To protect her meant standing against his own kind, to mark himself in their eyes as a traitor. And yet, he did not waver. Across the fire, Nayeli's shoulders softened, as though some invisible weight had shifted from her back. She still trembled, but her trembling no longer seemed like fear. It was the aftershock of breaking silence, of stepping out from a grave into air again. The flames hissed, wood cracking, sparks rising like fleeting stars. The cabin smelled of smoke and coffee grounds left too long in the pot. Outside, the wind pushed against the shutters, whispering across the fields. Elias found himself speaking, his voice low, as though confessing to the fire itself. "I buried my wife with words I never said," he murmured, sat by her grave in silence, thinking silence was enough. But it wasn't. Nayeli listened, her gaze steady. "This house," Elias went on, "was built with love. Then grief filled it. And now," he stopped, shaking his head, "now it holds something I don't yet understand." The fire burned lower, coals glowing red. Nayeli drew her shawl close, her eyes soft but unflinching. "Not silence," she said simply. Elias looked at her then. Truly looked, the braids falling loose from the day's work. The scars that told of suffering endured. The strength in her posture, even when her body trembled. He saw not just the girl who had been chained, but the woman who had chosen to speak. The fire between them was no longer only danger. It was warmth. It was fragile trust. And in that trust, something unspoken, something that might one day be called love. The reckoning came with the thunder of hooves. At dawn, the horizon filled with dust as riders drew near. More than before, a dozen or more men, their faces grim beneath wide-brimmed hats. And with them, the sharp gleam of sabers, the heavy clatter of cavalry. Elias stood at the fence line, rifle in his hands, his body steady as the land itself. The men reined in their horses, dust swirling like smoke around them. The leader, the same thick-set ranch hand who had come before, pointed a gloved hand toward the cabin. "Time's done," he barked. "You give her over, Harrow, or we take her by force." "She ain't yours." "She don't belong." From the shadow of the cabin door, Nayeli watched, her shawl drawn tight, her braids falling like dark rivers over her shoulders. She did not bow her head this time. Her gaze held steady, though her breath came fast. Elias raised the rifle. His voice, when it came, was calm, low, iron-bound. "She belongs to no one." A murmur rippled through the men. Some shifted uneasily in their saddles. Others spat into the dust, faces hard. A cavalry officer nudged his horse forward, the sun striking the brass on his belt. "This is army business now," the officer declared. "Hand her over and save yourself. Harboring her will cost you more than land, more than blood." Elias's finger rested near the trigger. He did not flinch. "You'll have to shoot me first." The standoff stretched taut as wire, one breath away from breaking. The horses snorted, restless. Leather creaked, sabers rattled. The weight of violence pressed heavy on the air, and then from the far ridge another rider appeared, a single figure on a dun-colored horse, his hair long, silver threaded through the black. He rode with the calm of one who had weathered storms greater than this. The men turned as he approached, their mutters uneasy. The rider drew to a halt before the gathering. His gaze passed over the settlers, the soldiers, and at last settled on Nayeli. A silence deeper than all the rest fell. He spoke in the Apache tongue, his voice low, rich with age. Nayeli's breath caught. Her hands clutched at her shawl, and for the first time, her voice rose strong in answer, words spilling out in her language, trembling with recognition. The elder's eyes softened. He dismounted, stepping closer to the cabin door. With a grave nod, he laid a hand against his chest, then toward Naeli. "Kin," he said at last, his English accented but clear. Shame prickled in the air. The settlers who had shouted loudest now looked away, muttering into their beards. The cavalry officer shifted, his jaw tight, but no order left his lips. One by one the riders turned their horses, dust rising as they pulled back. None wanted to be the first to fire on a rancher standing with a rifle, nor to argue with blood claimed by blood. When at last the hoofbeats faded into distance, only silence remained, the wide, clean silence of land restored to itself. Naeli sank against the doorframe, her shawl slipping from her shoulders. The fire within her, held so long, broke free into sobs. Not the silence of chains, not the silence of fear, sound at last, raw and human. Elias set the rifle aside and stepped forward. He did not touch her, but he stood near, letting his presence steady the space. The elder waited, patient, his eyes kind but weighted with grief of his own. When Naeli lifted her head, he extended a hand. She hesitated, then placed her own within it. Her voice broke, but her words held firm. "I will go." Elias saddled a horse at dusk. The sky bled scarlet into violet. The canyon in the distance cut deep as a wound. Naeli mounted behind him, her hands light against the saddle horn, her breath close enough that he could feel its warmth through the cool air. The elder rode ahead, silent. The land unfolded in silence, mesquite casting long shadows, the smell of sage rising sharp, the sound of the river far below in the canyon. Elias rode steady, each hoofbeat echoing the truth he already knew. This was the end of their crossing, the parting written from the beginning. At the canyon rim, the elder dismounted. From the far side came faint voices, shapes moving in the half-light, her people, waiting. Naeli slid from the saddle, her braids catching the last of the sun. For a moment she stood still, caught between past and present, silence and voice. Then she turned to Elias. Her eyes glistened, but they did not lower. She reached out, her hand trembling, and laid it over his. No words passed between them. None were needed. Gratitude, sorrow, and something unspoken flowed in that brief touch. Then she stepped away, following the elder toward the voices waiting in the darkening canyon. The ride back was slow, the stars breaking one by one across the sky. Elias returned alone, the saddle behind him empty, the cabin waiting in silence. Yet the silence was different now. Not the silence of grief, nor the silence of emptiness. The hearth glowed as he lit the fire, its warmth filling the cabin. The rocking chair creaked beneath his weight. He sat, watching the flames flicker. And for the first time in years, the firelight felt like company. Not memory. He had lifted her head. Yes. But in truth she had lifted his spirit, unshackling him from the grave of his own silence. Outside, the wind moved softly across the fields. Inside, the fire burned steady, and the house was no longer a tomb.